Welcome to Leeway 10 Pod, Series 2. My name is Luke Hereford. I'm an associate artist for Leeway Productions, and alongside some special guests, I will be hosting this series. Today's co-host is a theatre director, applied theatre facilitator and music maker from Mid-Wales. Currently trainee director at the Royal Court, she's also the co-artistic director of Run Amok Theatre Company and Under the Sun. As a musician, her work can be seen with the band The Murmurings, and she recently released the EP Masomar with singer and producer Edith Crawford. Welcome to Leeway 10 Pod, Izzy Rabey. Hello.
Hi, Luke.
How's it going?
Good. Thanks so much for having me on.
You're very welcome. It's great to see you. Our guests can't see you currently, but you are surrounded by many plants.
Thank you. Yes, no, I'm in my own sort of indoor jungle at the moment because we can't go outside much at the moment.
Well, yeah, that's it. Emulating the outside world from inside. It's basically been my mantra since March 2020.
Yeah, we're all about that energy at the moment.
Absolutely. So today we are going to be talking a little bit about queer influence on Welsh musical theatre. So just before we introduce our guest today, I want to ask you the question, how visible do you think queer theatre is in Wales?
Oh, well, I'm gonna say a very strong and confident, not very. I think it's really funny when we think about the arts. Like we have, obviously, there's loads of queer people in the arts, but in terms of institutions boosting the profile of those queer artists or supporting queer work, there is still very little representation there, especially in Wales and especially in the Welsh language. I still think there is a lot of work to be done around all intersectionality and sort of minority communities, really. But I think that, we still have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I largely would agree with that strong, not very, which I'm sure we'll get more into it as we discuss with our guest. Let's introduce him. Our guest for today's episode is Seiriol Davies. He's a performer, writer, composer, and lyricist from Anglesey. He writes fabulous, flamboyant, funny musicals that serve a great night out, earworms, and knotty political questions in a cannon full of glitter. He comes from a background in cabaret, performance art, and Welsh mysticism, and his heart thrives on crowd-pleasing key changes and dumb jokes.
His first musical, How to Win Against History, was a smash hit at the 2016 and 2017 Edinburgh Fringe Festivals, being the best reviewed show of the entire festival in its premiere year. His next show, Milky Peaks, was in tech when the first lockdown hit and will be opening at Theatr Clwyd and touring when such things are possible. He has been awarded the Stage Award for Acting Excellence, a Wales Theatre Award and the Samuel Beckett Theatre Trust Award, and he has made work with Punch Drunk, The Bush, The Young Vic, Cwmni Fran Wen, Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru, Sherman Theatre and many others.
In this song from Milky Peaks, Seiriol's character Davies is a rural gay boy who really wants to be special. It seems like a dream come true when a new gay club opens in town and he's asked to be the manager and poster boy for it. However, the dream comes with a price, and soon he is embroiled with a scary new political party rising in the town who want to use his acceptable gayness to make their extreme views more attractive.
Lollipops, party poppers, 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 pop, 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 fwa! Special, 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 special. You don't know me, special. Hey, but you will. Special. I am a jewel, individual, like a clock that goes.
How does it go?
Talk then tick. I am pure different,
Yeah.
authentic,
Tick, 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 tick.
authentic.
Well, hello, Mr. Popular.
Look, there's Dewi in the middle right there, with the interesting face and the special hair, like an artisanal fruit bowl you can buy in IKEA's. I wanna be special, exactly like he is. I wanna pop, 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 pop. I need to be me, I need to be me, I need to be me, I've got to be me. I am me, many me's is us, LGBTIQ Q+. We represent every letter, but let's be honest, it's mainly the G, G, G. It's mainly the G, G, G. I need to be as me as possible. Pop, 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 pop.
Pop's American for dad, and dad is often happy.
Sad, but also that. Forget about him. You're here to get all clubby.
You're right, here I don't need any man's approval. Here I can just be me freely.
Oh my god, babes, you look lush.
What do you think so really?
I wanna pop, 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 pop. Dancing. Individual. Face, face. Meanwhile on the edge of town.
To me, my heart old masses, join me in this town. You see of anxious faces, overwhelmingly non-brown. To me, you swarm of outcasts, cast out just for being far right. With your sleeping bags and your little flags, and so many jars of Marmite. Sing it!
Oh, the youthquakes, oh, the snowflakes, made a blizzard and out here we'll freeze. We need refuge from the deluge. Of course that doesn't make us refugees.
I will claw out with my fingernails a new Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant Wales.
Cause I need to be me, I need to be me, I need to be me, I've got to be me. If you're inside a rainbow tent, you automatically win any moral arguments. We're here for every letter, but let's be honest, we're mainly the G, G, G. We're mainly the G, G, G. I need to be as me as possible.
That was I Need to Be Me from Milky Peaks, and welcome, Seiriol, to the conversation today.
Oh,
Hello.
Seiriol. How's it going?
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. It's all good. I'm just attempting to raise the visibility of queer theatre in the Wales landscape. What have you been talking about?
Something quite similar, actually. So,
Oh wow, maybe we should have a chat about it.
yeah, good coincidence that you kind of snuck in there after we played one of your songs.
Oh god,
Wow.
I know. I just smelt it in the air and was just like, I need to get on this Zencaster call. Yeah, I'm good. I've been writing a lot. I've been fortunate enough to be in a position where I've been able to get into a development stage on a number of projects during lockdown. So I've been able to write and actually workshop some things over the last year. So it's been way less bad than it has been for other people. So I feel very #blessed for that. But yeah, it's still frustrating not to have things out in the world. But, you know, worst things happen to say.
Just going to dive in with quite a big question for you.
Go for it.
What does queerness mean to you, and how does it manifest itself in your work?
Oh, cool. Thanks. So the whole conversation. I find queerness to be a sort of a small p political choice that you make as a person to look at the world. I think it's a way of receiving the overall narratives of a dominant culture and picking apart its value systems and then regurgitating them back as a new, exciting story that is more inclusive and is subversive. It's fun, it's often draggy, it's often LGBTQIA plus associated, but I think not always, and I don't think it has to be. I think it is a way of fundamentally taking what we're told the world is like and going, really? And then flipping it on its head. And I think if we can we who are in various subcultures and intersectional subcultures we sort of come with an inbuilt ability to see the dominant narratives as what they are, rather than as sort of natural order of things, how things should be. Like we often grow up feeling that we're not part of the overall narrative, and therefore we sort of, there is an opportunity for us to look at dominant narratives and unpick them. That doesn't mean that everyone within the LGBTQIA plus umbrella is always queer, and that's why I think it's a choice. I don't think it is a default. And I also think that people who are not under that umbrella can absolutely be queer as well. So I think for me, it is, alongside something like camp, it is a lens, it is a leer, it is a twisting of a story, it is. It's a narrative choice. It's a life choice, really. Like, it is a way of rejecting what sort of quote unquote patriarchal values we're told, and spitting them out. In my case, in a ton of glitter.
Great, that's great, and I think it's really, you touched on something really interesting there, which is the idea of subcultures and how they kind of then often feed into the work. What kind of specific subcultures influence your work specifically?
I draw a lot on my Welsh language culture. There is no sort of tight term for that, but like Welsh language culture, upbringing, and queerness. And I was thinking in preparation for this conversation, which I obviously fell upon by accident when you played my song. I found myself digging into like where those instincts come from, and weirdly enough, I started to think about my Sunday school, where I was taught. Both my parents were Sunday school teachers, and in both their classes, like, they were just really badass. Like, they would go like, so here's the story that we're supposed to study today. Let's take it apart. What are the values within it? But then often they would be like, just so you know, the Bible is just a selection of stories that were chosen by, what is it, the Council of Nicaea. A bunch of men got together in a room, picked and chose what stories they wanted. Therefore, it is for us to sculpt as we go along. They were like, the four, what are they, the apostles? Ever long word? The four apostles, like, it's the New Testament is like hella postmodern. Like, it is four different viewpoints on the same thing. It's so 90s it hurts. Like, and those viewpoints often differ. And like, if that doesn't tell you that a narrative is meant to be porous and is meant to be subjective, then I don't know what will. And I find it really odd that we often think of the Bible as this monolith that is that you either sort of accept or do not. Like, it's a postmodernist text. And like, I was like, that's flipping queer. And then like, I grew up in the totally Eisteddfod tradition, where on the reg, like, Rotarian business people will get dressed up in robes and worship a big sword, while floral dancers chuck things around. And I was just like, not just points of information. Like, I've like that. I feel like we're on a similar wavelength, I think. It's just that you haven't quite necessarily accepted it into your life as your Lord and Saviour. So I think that is. I think something like this, because I'm doing a show at the moment. We're developing it. We're sharing in Llanrwst, but I'm doing a show with Cymru Ran Wen and the Eisteddfod and with Stonewall Cymru called Corn Glad, where we look on the Orsedd tradition. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with this, but it is it's sort of the Druidic order is sort of the Welsh language culture honours system, I guess, and then they honour a poet and a novelist and so forth and a musician every year, and they get dressed up in big robes and swords, and some of them are gold, and they throw flowers around, and it's all apparently very butch and very Welsh. But this tradition we think of, or we tend to default into thinking of as being as old as the hills, but it was actually invented in the 1700s by a lord nomadic called Iolo Morgannwg while he was in debtor's prison. He absolutely made it up from the ground up. So we took a look at this story and we decided to make a drag Orsedd that told the story of the Orsedd, but through the crucible of this maniac who, in a beautiful way, saw that all of our Welsh oral history had been lost, or had been, ground away into different sub stories. And he was like, "Oh, sod it, let's just make up a new one." And then everyone just believed him, because I think we have a thirst for this primal culture that very few of us actually have. So everyone just glommed to it. And even after he was revealed as a total fraud, people were like, "Nah, should we just keep it?" And we are making the show. We thought that's freaking gorgeous, but it doesn't stop with what he'd invented. Like, we need to keep inventing rituals that make us feel connected, whether or not they're old. Like, old doesn't add any virtue into the equation. All you need is a ritual that celebrates what you care about as a collective people. So yeah, that the Eisteddfod and all of that. Like, I hope I'm being very hyper-caffeinated, but like, this idea of subcultures being able to define themselves as themselves, rather in relation to the larger narratives of heteroculture, of English culture. We can define ourselves in relation to them rather than just in opposition or trying to copy them. Like, I think in the queer world, there is often an instinct to be the same as straight people, to have the same things as them, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I just don't think that's queer. And in the same way, you will often see in the culture of Welsh language culture, a need and a desire to make like a well-made play that is about Welsh stories, but is just made in an English way. And again, that seems like a shame when we have forms that we either have inherited or can just make up. Like choral recitation. Choral recitation is a thing that we do, and it is done in the Eisteddfod by groups really amazingly, and it's like Greek chorus, and it's gorgeous, and it's really seismic, and it's really moving. And then like, they just do it for that 1 week a year. And then we're like, why are there no shows done in this form? So Milky Peaks is done as a Greek chorus. So like, there are characters in it, and there are sort of song numbers in it, but the whole thing is narrated by this Greek chorus. Because I wanted to use that form. And yeah, so like, I'm really excited about touching into what's unique about the things that I grew up with that excite me as a storytelling method.
How would you define like Welsh queerness? Because I feel there's still a lot of fear around queer Welsh representation on stage. And I feel like this kind of links a lot to sort of our quite fragile sense of like national identity and what is a Welsh person. I think we're constantly, as Welsh people, trying to fight to kind of like define what that is, and it's obviously very indefinable. So I was just wondering, in terms of modern kind of Welsh queerness, what do you interpret that as, and in terms of how that links up with our Welsh national identity, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's really knotty, isn't it? I think it's I'm going to get smacked down by so many linguists for this, I'm sure, but Cymru, the word Welsh word for Wales, means this land we share. So that's quite a good touchstone to keep coming back to. It doesn't necessarily talk about blood. It doesn't necessarily talk about any specific icon of culture. Make of that what you will. But as I've touched upon, as you said, like, I think that it is often tempting for a subculture to define itself by either copying or just opposing a dominant culture. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can. I don't think you can build your own house using whatever the expression is, using your master's tools or whatever. But Welsh, I don't know. I just don't think Welsh queerness necessarily needs to be defined by what RuPaul's Drag Race is doing, although God knows I love it. But like, I don't think it wants to be defined by what East London is doing. Like, I don't like, these are all patches of different people's interpretations of what their identity is. Like, I don't know how to answer that question. Could you rephrase the question?
Well, it was just interesting to me in terms of like how you define kind of Welsh culture and how that links up with queerness. I think for me it's also, and we were saying earlier around kind of how your work is always kind of connected to myth, and how, what I find so interesting about Welsh culture is how myth sits alongside just the everyday, and how every town has a myth, every location has a myth, and we grow up kind of being surrounded by that. And for me, and again, I remember in primary school being told, myth is a story that might or might not have happened, and there was this very like casual attitude towards it. And for me, I'm like, that's so exciting in terms of when we think of like theatre and performance, and and what you were saying about kind of the multitude of truths that that exist.
Absolutely.
And the different interpretations of that. And I think for me, I think that's something often kind of is sort of forgotten when we talk about kind of like queerness in Wales as well. It's like we are a land of kind of story. Some are true, some aren't. And we can kind of pick and choose and kind of make those what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, they really put your finger on it. Like, it is this porousness of history, partially because all of our history was oral and like was annihilated. So like we have the Mabinogi, which were written to sort of be a propaganda history tool to keep our sort of flame alive by making this fiction about when we were totally awesome and had giants and everyone was afraid of us. And I think that's gorgeous. And like I'm working on a show with Cymru Bran Wen which is a reinterpretation of Branwen, which really digs into that sense. But this idea of history sitting next door to myth, I find that really exciting. A lot of my work involves sort of unpicking received narratives. Like How to Win Against History is about unpicking the story of a potentially queer man who did not fit into the pattern of history that his family expected of him. So it's about Henry Saul Paget, the fifth Marquis of Anglesey, who was one of the richest men in the world, and he decided to spend it all on putting on fabulous musicals with him in the lead, wearing a costume made of diamonds. And then after he died, his family burnt every trace of him that existed and tried to carry on as though he'd never existed. And so like we turned that into a show that was, fun, rollicking, sparkly, but it was actually about queer erasure. And I find it quite an exciting red rag to me personally to take on this monolith that we think of as British history, world history, Welsh history, whatever, and just going, really? And if it feels like, as is always the case, there is a bias or there is an erasure or there is just a lie at the core of it, I sort of consider it our duty to just make up another lie.
Absolutely. That's the joy of working in theatre.
Exactly. Or just a myth that works alongside the received history, that prods at it. Because like if we can't learn anything good from the history, then what is the point of it? It's like that Sunday school class. Like if we smell a rat in this, if we think that the council who chose this particular book, the person who wrote this particular history book, the person who wrote this particular any novelist from any time period who we just take off as defining the values of that period, is that true? Probably not. Let's make a parallel one, because our myths, they either teach us something or they don't.
Yeah. And it's so funny. I was just, as you were speaking about that and, and picking and choosing kind of how we think about history, I was thinking a lot about Patagonia and how growing up as a Welsh-speaking person, you're kind of told, like, wasn't it amazing? We went to Patagonia and everyone speaks Welsh in Patagonia, and that's so cool. And it's kind of a lot of like Welsh people grow up being like, that's really cool. And you're like, and I think it is very recent in our consciousness. We're like, that was hella colonial, and like that was mega colonialism. But still, along in Welsh-speaking communities, like I think because we are, a minority culture, we don't want to acknowledge our own parts to play in colonial history, and that's something that I'm really interested in, because I think Wales really presents itself as like, with this small nation, we're fighting to preserve our culture all the time, but it's like, but we also have contributed to, like the genocide of other areas. And I think that's really interesting in terms of like how we imagine ourselves as a nation and how we're so obsessed with imagining ourselves as a nation.
Yeah, I just think there's only so far you can go playing the underdog, and I think that's a big thing to say.
Absolutely.
But the Milky Peaks itself, but Milky Peaks, because there's a show that's on my mind a lot at the moment. But Milky Peaks itself, which is now what it's called, is a show that was inspired by two things that I learnt that prodded at the two pillars of my life as I've set them out. I was obviously raised Welsh language culture, blah 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 blah. acoustic guitar songs about oppression. Everything seemed good, close harmony, blah, blah, blah. And then at a certain age, I learned that Nick Griffin, the then leader of the BNP, had a house in Heartland, Wales, moved there with his family and raised his kids Welsh speaking. And I couldn't shake the idea that that was because he identified with our sense of like, it's us versus the outsider. And that really niggled.
Yeah.
And then a later conversation I had was with a youngish, old enough to know better, but a youngish gay guy, cis white gay guy, who said that he thought that gay bars should be men only because they should be safe spaces. And again, like I could see the logic, but you don't get it. And so Milky Peaks is about a small town, very, very Welsh, very, very Welsh language culture, like to an absurd degree because it's a me show. Like it's in Catherine Jenkins oven gloves and inflatable daffodils a go-go, but it's the shtick is they learn on St David's Day during the parade, which there is apparently, that they're nominated for the Britain's Best Town Award. And this is all great because the town is on the financial skids and they really need the investment. And this sets off various plots in motion. And it's towards the interval that they learn that it's not actually Britain's best town. It's a town award being given by Britain's Best, which is a new extreme right-wing party who really digs their keep the outsiders out policy and wants to move there in order to sanitize their views. And as we heard at the top of the show, as part of that, they tap into the insecurities of Dewi, my character, who comes out at the top of the show and he's like, I'm gay. And everyone's like, okay. And he's just like, where is my coming out narrative? Like, I was told that being gay was really spectacular. He has this weakness in him from the beginning. There is this tragic flaw that he feels that he's been denied specialness. And the show sort of picks and gnaws at people's sense of wanting to be individual, and when wanting to be individual tips over into oppressing other people is when you really have to worry. Like it's when patriotism tips over into xenophobia. It's when defining yourself as a club means that you start to exclude people who need you, and it's all those kind of questions, and that's why like that song is called "I Need to Be Me," and that sort of vibe continues through the show until it becomes really poisonous. And the sort of the heart phrase of the show for me is it poison to want to protect what you love? And it is really naughty, and there is no answer to it. And I think the answer we come to in the show is change is going to happen. It's not always going to be good, but you need to cling on to what actually matters for you, not some identifying characteristic that may be getting in the way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think like we contain multitudes,
Absolutely.
Don't we? And within those multitudes, there are contradictions. Yeah. And I think that kind of our sort of patriarchal, like capitalist culture teaches us it's like there's one, right way of being and right way of existing. And you can't make mistakes. And if you make mistakes, you are a bad person forever and ever, amen. And I think that kind of that's something, especially I think in the social media context these days, is really difficult to move away from. You have to be seen to be doing the right thing all the time, and if you don't, like we've been put in such opposition of each other now, and I think that it's brilliant to kind of pick away at that.
I think we have to, because we know the world cannot be split evenly into two camps on anything. And like then you go into a situation where you're like, haha, you don't actually believe 100% of the values of the thing that you ascribe to, and I'm like, of course they bloody don't. And like, how?
Yeah. Who does?
And it's like, you just have to just dig into the fact that you will always have to compromise part of your character. You will always have to soften. You will always have to accept that there are things about you that are. There is a sort of an intense intersectionality of privilege, which is, I know, a big buzzword, but like, you have had advantages, whether or not you feel like you have. You just have to own that, and it doesn't mean you're a bad person, and it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to want things, and it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to suffer. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to feel like you're suffering. Like in Branwen, like this interpretation of Branwen, which, as I said, the original story is very much written as a power fantasy, like a beautiful power fantasy. and it's a tragic story of the downfall of that fantasy. But it's really interesting because it's all like we were giants and we totally pwned all of Britain, and Ireland was totally annihilated because we were so hot. And it's just like, okay, babe, like your power fantasy is just replicating the forms that you're worried about. Like, it's not enough to just be like, well, you bullied me, I'm going to bully you.
Absolutely. I think you've tapped into something so interesting there around kind of like when speaking about myth and how like we are so obsessed with giants for being such a small country. Like, we bloody love a giant. Like, let's put it in every story because we're like tiny. We're like, we will always have a giant to, like, you know, avenge our nation.
It's because we've got tiny,
that's such an important point.
tiny legs. But once we were giant, true. And you know whose fault it is? Yeah. The English, and sometimes the Irish.
The English made us not giants.
Yeah. That's what they did. Once we had to live in the mountains, we became tiny.
We've already addressed all of these, the way that we kind of use our own subcultures to tell stories, possibly LGBTQ plus subcultures or Welsh subcultures or just queer subcultures, whatever that may mean to anyone who's making work. And I think that we're, in musical theatre specifically, we're far too hung up on the model that has been sort of dictated by the West End or the commercial. And how do you think we can start to move away from that?
Well, the way I do it is to try and not do that. If I feel like a story,
just not doing it,
or just giving up. No. It is just to try and think of other ways of saying it. I often think like, sure, that show. No, I'm not thinking about any particular show, but if I see a show and I'm like, that is an LGBTQ plus or a Welsh story, but like, you could just lift that out, and the rest, mm-hmm. the operating parameters of the show is still the same, and I just think that's a shame.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. As I said, as I blithered about earlier, like, I just think there are so many more interesting forms that we can take. But I think that you can arise from different directions. Like, I came at it from cabaret, so all of my stuff is at least a little bit direct address. And like, it is very much about the liveness, which really sucks at the moment because like, I'm like, could we do it on video? No, because the whole thing involves the liveness and the eyeballing of the audience. And like, I worked for years, well, some years in cabaret and like the Nos on Lawen tradition, and like all of this sense is about the communality in the room and the liveness in the room. And that's what I really like. It's like, there's a story, but we're not pretending that you're not here. We're not pretending that this story is going to be clean. We're not pretending that we're telling this story objectively. All of these sort of things that you fall into when you put a fourth wall in front of people. And then you immediately start to think like, do you think that you don't have a position on this story? Do you think that this is somehow a documentary now? I think that you can make a big musical with 3 people. I think you can make a massive story, you know, with a piece of fabric. Where if you wave it, it's like the sea. No, that was a bad example. But like, you can take people epic places. You don't have to, just because if you've got small resources, that doesn't mean that you can't aim big. And this is something that the outlay of being an artist now, how difficult it is to actually survive in it at all within, in certain ways. I think you should just aim as big as possible all the time. Like, I talk to people being like, oh, I just want to do an Edinburgh show. And I'm like, or I just want to do like a show to run for a week in such and such space. And I'm like, that's cool, but why don't you do something that can do that, but somebody could come and see it, or somebody could, like, that could groundswell into something that's big. Like, you can aim narratively high, like you can make a short version, like you can, if you show how much you care about something, how big you think the story is, you can, like, things can resonate beyond themselves. And I think that is the way to find new and exciting voices. And that is a way to get out of the trap of just copying what you've seen in the West End or in Broadway or at the National or whatever.
Yeah. And it feels like if you have got limited resources to kind of making work, like, if you can only thinking of this from a sort of producerial angle, if you can only, I think I just made up a word,
Producerial, yeah.
producerial. Yeah,
It almost has
got your
my name
in it as well.
It's delicious.
It's great.
If you can only afford, 3 people and a piece of cloth or whatever and a stick, using other ways to make the story big,
Yeah,
isn't it?
exactly.
Like you said, like using, whatever that may be to you. But also, I think there's a lot to be said for, and I think this is the same for all musical theatre, really, content dictating form. A lot of the sort of more commercial musicals that don't necessarily have a legacy are ones that have been made in the shape of other ones that have come before them, whereas the ones that have had a legacy, Les Mis has a legacy because it was a musical about 1800s France with an 80s pop rock score.
Yeah.
And so we look at it now as like the monolith of like all musicals should be like this, but actually it was kind of punk in its day, if we in 1986.
Yeah, exactly. As you said, content can address form, and like some of the big musicals, like Cabaret does that. Like it beds it in a live experience, and like you could do Cabaret in a cabaret. That's why it works, and you can also do it in big. Something like Come From Away, like it arises from this sort of sitting around in a pub telling a story type vibe. Like you don't, and you actively shouldn't. I mean, by all means, do, because the more the marketplace is clogged with stuff that doesn't work, the better it is for other people. But very few people will find their voices trying to ape something else. That doesn't mean you can't be influenced by things, but I firmly believe if you're pushed into a corner and you just can't afford the kick line that you want, you'll find another way to tell that bit of the story. And like musicals, as you say, are they more clearly have that vibrancy because they are already quite heightened as forms. I think we default into thinking that plays are more quote unquote realistic generally, but I would always quiz that. People always go like, oh, in musicals people always burst into song, and I'm like, yeah, but in your play people pretend that one of the walls doesn't exist. So I mean, where do you want to go from there? If we're going to start picking holes, like it gets dark.
There's always a suspension of disbelief.
There is.
Isn't there? Like always.
You can do a totally diegetic musical where all of the people are literally singing in the room, or you can do one where they're all singing in their imagination, or you can do a mix, and it doesn't matter. Like something like Spring Awakening, like it's half play, half gig, I guess you could describe that as. And that works because like the story, because you're just pulled along by the story. You don't go like, actually, what's happening? And I think because it's so heightened, people are sometimes afraid of that heightenedness. And I think often people then apologize for the heightenedness and try and make it be more palatable. And I think that people smell a rat with that all the time. If they just go like, oh, it's a play essentially where every few minutes it stops and then people sing a song about their feelings, because people are like, well, people understand love songs, and I'm like, yep, cool. I already also know that you love each other, so I've just now got 3 minutes to think about that. Whereas like you can write a song which takes us from 1600s Venezuela on a voyage through time to Antarctica in 2012. Like you can do what you want in a song because it's already heightened. And I'm like, well, just use that then, because that doesn't actually require a budget. All you require is to set the notes and the words of telling that story, and then to sing it staring somebody in the face, and then take them there. That's my style anyway.
Yeah. I think that's, and I love that around, because it's all about imaginative investment from the audience, isn't it? And I think that kind of, for me, often like productions that I find really frustrating are when the audiences are told how to feel or how to think. And it's like what I love about music, it's kind of, you're opening that up a bit more to interpretation, and kind of certain notes might resonate for different people for different reasons, and I think that we get so, I find theatre can sometimes be quite prescriptive in terms of like, you must feel this now, you must respond in this way now. And I think when we kind of engage with a range of different theatrical forms, be that music, dance, glitter bombs, you're able to sort of, that heightened state can often allow a wider expanse of interpretation.
Absolutely. The one I always drag out, like the music creates automatic subtext if you allow it to, and it also creates automatic dramatic irony. Like if somebody is singing happy words to a sad melody, the audience is getting a lot of information that it would take ages of dialogue to tell them, or like just a really, really focused performance that not everyone would get. So like, it just opens access ways, but also like it can allow a breadth of interpretation, and it can also sort of play around with the legitimacy of the narrator, which obviously, based on what I've been banging on about, like, is really important to me. Like, if you can absolutely in a play as well, but in a musical, I quite often like to play with the idea of literally telling the audience how to feel, but they know that the person telling them that is compromised. So you're like, you should now feel that this awful queer Welsh protagonist, like, he thinks that he knows what's best, but he's an idiot. And then you know that there's a disconnect between what the narrator is telling you, what the play is telling you. And that if we often conflate those two things, we think we can do, we forget that we can do a show that is, like, that is telling us the opposite of what we should be thinking. Like, I often like to write, my preferred songs are often the songs that are like the villain songs that are just espousing all of the, like, slanging me with hate, like just espousing all of the ways in which my worldview is just wrong. Those are the funnest to write, and those are the funnest to engage in. And that's, like, that's why everyone loves a pantomime villain. That's why everyone loves that certain kind of drag queen or drag king that just, like, takes you to that point of, like, this is what we're up against, and we're going to sit in it, and we're going to enjoy feeling these feelings because we have to understand them. Otherwise, otherwise we can't engage with them. And I love that you said that glitter bomb was an artistic form.
It bloody is. It
100% is.
I was wondering, Seiriol, what would you say is the difference between LGBTQIA plus theatre and queer theatre? Is there a difference?
I think this is connected to something I said earlier on. Like, I think queerness and LGBTQIA plus are Venn diagrams that cover a lot of the same people, but they don't necessarily cover the same people. And I think that I don't necessarily think that there is very much of this at all, but I think that stuff that is not LGBTQIA plus can be queer, and stuff that is LGBTQIA plus can absolutely be not queer. Like, you see something that is just like, well, that's cool, but you're not queer. Like, you want to do a story that will mean that you're copying the forms of non-queer theatre, and that's totally fine. But, like, you have so much more that you have access to, and you can't. One of your privileges, you may not see it as a privilege, one of your privileges is not fitting in, because that gives you access to a sort of a side, a behind the scenes, like behind the curtain, behind the Wizard of Oz curtain view on the world that everyone else, a lot of other people still accept as just the way things are. And when you are in one of these, when you do come from one of these subcultures or an intersectionality of them, you do have a unique perspective. And I just think it's a shame not to use that. Like, but there's nothing wrong with a straight up drama that has a LGBTQIA plus protagonist or character. Like, I'm absolutely not saying there's anything wrong with that, but for me, that's not queer, and I don't think they're the same.
I'd completely agree with you, and I think I would much rather see, but just from a personal opinion, would much rather see something that kind of embodies queerness in every inch of its being as a production as well as a story. I think there's the difference between queer stories and queer productions necessarily.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I always
100%. And a lot of the sort of the surface qualities of queerness often belie a lack of queerness as well. Like, you can see some drag queens who you're like, oh, you're none of this is actually queer beyond the initial act. I don't think you've actually thought about this at all. Again, which is cool. But I just, like, things can look very much like one and not be. And not that I'm in the business of policing between the one and the two. Like, but you know what I mean? Like, these things can be tricksy.
Thank you so much for chatting with us, Seiriol, and it's been really amazing to hear your thoughts and hear a little bit more about your work and the way that you come at things. But one last question before you go. What do you think is next for musical theatre in Wales?
Well, some of my shows are going to come out, but
yay!
I've got so many.
Awesome.
I don't know. Like, I look forward to seeing. Like, I hadn't had the opportunity to work very much in Wales until after How to Win got my name out a little bit. But since I've been working more in Wales over the last few years, I've met so many people whose voices I really want to be out there more than they are, and I can't wait to see those voices flourish, and I can't wait to be part of a community that gets those voices out there.
Thank you for listening to Leeway 10 Pod Series 2. You can stay up to date on all of our news on Twitter at LeewayProds and by using the hashtag Leeway10Pod. You can also view captioned versions of all of our episodes on our YouTube channel.